The desert night clung to his shoulders like a dark shawl. The air smelled of diesel and jasmine, and somewhere far off a generator hummed with the monotony of machines that keep secrets alive. In the lobby of a glass and steel tower, marble floors reflected neon and whispered conversations, and the faint metallic tang of strong coffee mixed with the papery odor of legal pads. On the 14th floor, a man in a pressed suit thumbed through spreadsheets under a single lamp, the small clock on his phone blinking seconds he did not notice. He had the quiet gestures of someone who moved money the way others moved armies, methodically, invisibly, with a patience that felt like cruelty. In a region that sits between oil pipelines and diplomatic backchannels, the finances he controlled rippled outward like an oil stain on water, and whoever could follow those stains could decide the fate of entire networks. How did a figure whose power was balance sheets and shell entities become the quarry of an intelligence service renowned for surgical operations? Over the next minutes, you will see who this man was, how his ledgers hid a web of influence, how investigators mapped trails of transfers and excuses, and how a decision taken in a dim room changed the calculus of power across borders. If you value precise, evidence-driven storytelling about covert operations, like this video, so more people can learn the mechanics behind modern conflict. It all converged on one late summer evening, a timing chosen for heat and deadlines. 34 seconds in a hallway would be recorded later as the moment everything shifted. Yusuf Karim was not born to secrecy. He arrived into the world in a cramped apartment above a sleepy bookshop in a coastal city that traded olives for patience. As a child, he cataloged stamps and receipts, arranging them like constellations. He liked the way small numbers made order of chaos. His teenage years were a ledger of contradictions. He worked nights at a local exchange office, learning the names of currencies and the smell of different countries' cash, while by day he studied economics at a university that prized argument over comfort. The first decisive loss came at 27, when his elder brother, a small-time contractor, died after a regulatory dispute left their family exposed. The official explanations were thin, and the compensation never arrived. That absence taught Yusuf two lessons that would define him. Institutions could fail the vulnerable, and money could be engineered to bypass failings. He began to build a practice for clients who preferred discretion over spectacle, offering advice to charities, businesses, and a few men with appetites for anonymity. Over time, his office grew from a single desk to a suite of rooms with books in multiple languages and a drawer of passports he rarely opened. He kept his habits private, his calls encrypted and routine, and his calendar full of coffee meetings that were brightness in otherwise shadowed negotiations. When foreign intelligence services noticed, he had curated a reputation as a fixer, an intermediary who could move resources where formal channels feared to tread. Behind the veneer of philanthropic memos and foundation names were legal structures engineered to insulate identities. Yusuf relied on a cascade of vehicles, trusts registered in jurisdictions known for secrecy, corporate shells that owned nothing tangible, and a lattice of intermediary accounts that blurred origin and destination. Transfers were routed through correspondent banks in neutral financial hubs, often split into sums that matched benign invoices, a technique that obscured totals without creating conspicuous spikes. He used a mix of old-school intermediaries and digital tools, Hawala-like couriers for urgent regional moves, encrypted messaging for coordination, and consultants in Geneva and Dubai who handled paperwork nobody read in detail. What made the operation dangerous to others was scale and intent. Millions moved not as isolated transactions, but as a steady hum, funding operations ranging from media buys to supply chains. He cultivated relationships with compliance officers at regional banks, offering hospitality, introductions, and plausible explanations that became a soft shield against suspicion. When politics shifted, those soft shields could harden into lifelines for groups that needed plausible economic faces. The complexity of his mesh was its defense. Each node trusted enough to transact, but never close enough to see the whole. Explaining these mechanisms to people outside finance required metaphors. He liked to tell clients that money is like water, and the systems are filters. Dirty water can still reach where it's intended if you know the pipes. The country that sheltered him was a geopolitical fulcrum, small in size but vast in strategic consequence, a crossroads between continents and a banking center for the region. Its neutral posture made it attractive to diplomats and money movers alike, and its public diplomacy leaned hard on growth and hospitality. That same openness was a vulnerability. Diplomats moved in late-night convoys, corporate delegations arrived in flurries, and the regulatory apparatus struggled to police every transfer without hampering legitimate commerce. Foreign powers watched from across borders, calculating influence in a place where reputations were currencies. For an intelligence service with experience in deniable actions, the calculus was simple: disrupt the flow, and you alter capability. Reveal the handlers, and you fracture the network. But any operation within this state carried diplomatic risk. Arrests could become headlines that required explanations, mistakes could create international incidents with long tails. The decision to act had to factor not only what would break on the ground, but what would shift in ministries and multilateral channels. That is why the hunt was not simply tactical, but strategic, combining financial forensics, human intelligence, and a precisely weighed appetite for exposure. The first threads that interested outside investigators were not dramatic. Unusual patterns flagged by a compliance officer named Fatima al-Said, small round-robin transfers that matched invoices for non-existent services. Fatima, a mid-level manager at a regional bank, logged them in a system and, following training,
escalated the anomalies. David Kahn, an analyst at a Western financial intelligence unit, cross-referenced those transfers with a cluster of charitable donations in a foundation named in an obscure offshore registry. Elena Morales, an investigative journalist, began receiving anonymized documents suggesting that funds served as payroll for shadow consultants. Tariq Mansour, a regional fixer who had briefly worked for Yusuf, spoke to a journalist in exchange for protective anonymity and mentioned a name that matched the spreadsheets. Inspector Kareem Nassar of the local police opened a quiet file when a complaint about shell company fraud arrived. Meanwhile, Leah Ben-Ami, a liaison in a foreign intelligence directorate, compiled threads from open sources and human reports. Patterns emerged when different eyes began to link the same nodes: a correspondent bank in Zurich, a law firm in Panama, a foundation with a board that met rarely and then in the margins of conferences. The mosaic created suspicion, but not certainty. Investigators needed irrefutable links between intent and movement. Pause for a moment. If you have reached this point, you already sense that much of this story depends on choices that are legal, ethical, and deeply political. What do you think is the most effective way to combat a network like this? Follow the money through forensic accounting, detain and prosecute the operators, or cut the diplomatic and commercial channels that let it breathe? Reply in the comments starting with "I believe that," so conversations stay focused. I read the comments and highlight the most insightful contributions in future episodes. Your perspective can shape how these stories evolve. Now back to the investigation. The team chose to follow the money relentlessly and to pair that work with discreet interviews and controlled exposures. The planning phase involved a small, compartmentalized cell. In an austere room smelling of machine oil and old paper, Leah convened a group of analysts and field operatives. David, the numbers man, spread printouts on a table and tapped lines of transfers with a finger. "These are the arteries," he said. "Cut them at source and the network weakens." Leah replied, "We need human confirmation. Financial trails are persuasive but unprovable without on-the-ground verification." Tariq, who knew local circuits, warned, "He rarely meets in public. He trusts details and paperwork more than people. You try to corner him and he vanishes into paperwork." Leah asked, "Who can get close without triggering suspicion?" Tariq named a string of social contacts and a local consultant in the hospitality industry. "We will test the explanations," David said. "We will not act until we have a node that links money to decisions, not just invoices." The group debated risk, diplomatic exposure versus letting the network continue. They ran simulations, practiced narratives, and scheduled a narrow window when travel and local distractions would make an operation less noticeable. The conversation stretched long into the night, punctuated by coffee cups and the rustle of pages, every sentence measured for consequence. Execution day felt ordinary until it
Did not. The hotel corridor smelled of dry cologne and lemon floor polish, air vents sighed above, and a steady drip from a hidden pipe timed steps in the distance. Yusef's movement that evening was predictable. A light meeting at a private dining room, papers arranged across a table. The operations team shadowed him at a distance. Two field operatives sat in the corner with civilian calm, trading small talk and observing gestures. At two moments there were dialogues that mattered: a receptionist asking for a reservation, Yusef responding with practiced courtesy; a waiter clarifying a dish, Yusef offering a small smile. The corridor door clicked. At a prearranged signal, a liaison moved into position. Dialogue between operatives in the hall was terse and repeated as contingency. "You see him?" "Yes." "Wait for my mark." "Copy." "Now." "Move." The movement was designed to avoid spectacle, executed in silence and precaution. The moment of confrontation lasted less than a minute in real time, but stretched like taffy in memory. Footsteps, the scrape of a shoe against marble, a hand adjusting a jacket. There was no dramatic shouting, no cinematic chase, only rapid containment and a transfer into custody that felt improbably domestic for an act with international implications. Importantly, the description here avoids procedural detail. The aim was containment and proof, not spectacle. Moment of tension 1. The hallway where decision and doubt met became an arena of internal conflict. Yusef paused before a door and remembered his brother's face, the ledger of his childhood that had taught him patterns could be broken. The operative who had trained for detachment hesitated, a flicker of humane doubt at the idea of taking a man whose power had always been ledgered, not gunpowder. For a breath they imagined different lives, the man who saves records and the team that erases them. That pause extended like an impossible hour, filled with memory and the weight of possible consequences. Moment of tension 2. In a dim office when documents were being copied, Elena Morales sat with a USB stick and thought of repercussions. She had sought truth as a shield, and now worried the shield might cut. A phone call came, a warning in a soft voice, and for a minute the journalistic instinct to publish collided with the legal and moral consequences of exposure. She chose delay, an ethical compromise that felt like self-betrayal and prudence at once. Moment of tension 3. Back at the command room, analysts watched screens showing transaction flows freeze. A single name was circled in red and an automated alert pinged. The team realized they had misread a node. A supposed link was an innocuous payroll. Confirmation bias had pushed prior interpretations. The lead felt embarrassed but resolute. Retract and verify or risk a catastrophic misstep. They chose the slower path, and in that choice, the story gained credibility at the cost of time. The immediate aftermath unfolded as competing narratives. Official statements from the host country, routine enforcement and legal procedure, released by a Ministry of Interior spokesman named General Amir Halabi, who spoke calmly about due process and cooperation. Press releases stressed that an individual had been detained for alleged financial irregularities, with no mention of foreign involvement. International media, guided by Elena's carefully curated leaks and David's declassified financial notes, suggested a coordinated intelligence action targeting a man suspected of funneling money to clandestine networks. Conspiracy threads bloomed online, some blaming rival states, others invoking shadowy international boards. Local officials provided documents that showed layers of legality: registrations, tax filings, invoices, while investigators pointed to patterns inconsistent with legitimate commerce: repeated routing through entities with no staff, donations that matched sudden spikes in activity for actors of concern, and a board of directors who met once a year in a different city. The official version and the intelligence interpretation coexisted, each plausible to different audiences. Diplomatic channels hummed as envoys asked for briefings and counsels cautioned restraint. For those accused, the silence of official deniability was a shield. For the investigators, public transparency risked blowing other leads. Several secondary players shaped the post-raid landscape. Dr. Samuel Weiss, a forensic accountant, published a meticulous report that traced payment patterns without accusing named parties, but providing the statistical backbone for press inquiries. Inspector Karim Nassar continued a local formal investigation on allegations of fraud and misrepresentation. General Amir Halabi navigated the political fallout with statements emphasizing sovereignty. Elena Morales negotiated what to publish and what to hold back, balancing the public's right to know with potential harm. Tariq Mansour, having given testimony, disappeared for safety, leaving gaps in the narrative. Each name appears with an action. Dr. Weiss explained methodologies. Karim filed charges. Leah briefed partners. David annotated threads, and Fatima guarded compliance records that would later prove critical evidence. The broader strategic reverberations were not limited to one building. The operation signaled that financial networks were now targets as important as physical supply lines. Governments reconsidered their thresholds for cooperation, banks tightened due diligence in the region, and foundations adjusted governance to avoid being exploited as cover. Some saw the move as necessary, a correction to shadow economies supporting violence and influence. Others argued it set a dangerous precedent. Using intelligence to police money flows could erode legal norms and diplomatic trust. The tension between secrecy for security and transparency for justice widened into policy debates within capitals. Markets showed small flinches as correspondent banks reevaluated exposure. NGOs complained of collateral damage as legitimate donations faced new scrutiny. 1 month later, there were arrests and sealed indictments in multiple jurisdictions. Youssef was held under charges of financial misrepresentation and aiding illicit groups, though defenders called the evidence circumstantial. 3 months on, a parliamentary inquiry in the host country criticized the handling of the operation and demanded clearer legal frameworks for foreign intelligence activity on its soil. 6 months from the raid, some charity registries had rewritten rules, correspondent banks instituted more stringent
screening, and the networks that once relied on porous channels shifted tactics, dispersing transactions into smaller, less traceable units and experimenting with new payment rails. The man at the center remained a contested figure, to some a financier of maligned actors, to others a scapegoat in a geopolitical operation. The strategic consequence was undeniable, a recalibration of how states and non-state actors used finance as an instrument of influence, and a reminder that in modern conflict, currency can be as lethal as a missile when it buys loyalty and silence. In the end, the human cost remained simple to describe and difficult to reconcile. A life that had been sum totals and contacts turned into court filings and whispers. Families rearranged their understanding of a man once known for neat ledgers and polite humor. The documented transfers proved irregular in structure and suspicious in timing, but motives and intent resisted tidy proof. Strategically, the operation underscored that intelligence agencies now see financial architecture as a battlefield, where cutting a line of funding can degrade an adversary as effectively as physical strikes. Ethically, it forced a question: who decides when secrecy is justified and when public process must prevail? If states act in the shadows to shape outcomes, what protections remain for innocent clients and legitimate actors caught in the net?
If this story leaves you with one thought, let it be that power increasingly flows through bank entries and encrypted messages rather than parades and proclamations. If it made you reconsider how modern conflicts are fought, subscribe for more careful investigations and share this video so the debate reaches others. The invisible hands that move money still shape destinies, and it is up to public scrutiny and accountable institutions to decide how, if at all, those hands should be constrained.